A brutal cop chained a starving German shepherd in the rain until a Navy SEAL and his K-9 arrived. Ice had been coming down on Highway 89 south of Bozeman since 4 in the afternoon, coating the road in a glaze that caught headlights and sent them back wrong. And the temperature outside Caleb Doss's truck had dropped to 7 degrees by the time the sky went fully dark. He was driving south for no reason he could name, the way he sometimes drove on nights when the apartment felt like a held breath. In the passenger seat, Rook lifted his head from the seat cushion and turned it toward the right side of the road, and then he stood, slowly, deliberately, which he never did on a moving road, and pressed his nose to the cold glass. Outside, through the sleet and the fence line of a property set back from the highway, Caleb could just make out a shape near a wooden post. A large dog, chained, sitting in the open field with no shelter behind it, and the ice coming down across its back like the world had simply forgotten it was there. What Caleb Doss found when he turned down that gravel drive would expose a cruelty that had been running for 8 months inside a county that wore a badge. If you're new here, this is the kind of story this channel tells. Subscribe before we go any further. You'll want to be here for what comes next. Caleb had done 11 years with the Naval Special Warfare Command and carried most of them somewhere in the middle of his chest where they didn't show from the outside. He was 39. He'd grown up in Missoula, the son of a woman who worked the front desk at a veterinary clinic and a man who drove long-haul freight and was away more than he was home. And Caleb had learned early to be self-sufficient in the particular way children do when there's no one around to notice the small emergencies. He'd enlisted at 18 because he needed something large enough to put himself into entirely, something with edges clear enough that he could always know exactly where he stood. The Navy had given him that. SEAL training had given him more, a version of himself he could depend on, a precision in his own actions that quieted the noise that had always been there underneath. He'd come back from his last deployment 14 months ago, not because he'd chosen to, but because a training accident in the Coast Province had taken 2 men and a dog, and Caleb had walked away from it with a shoulder that worked differently than before and a quiet that had settled over him like a second skin. The dog's name was Atlas. He had been with Caleb for 4 years, a black Malinois trained for patrol and detection who slept against Caleb's bunk and never made a sound except twice, both times when the situation had already shifted before the humans in the room understood it. Caleb had written a letter to Atlas's original trainer, a woman in Virginia named Susan Park, and had not sent it because there was nothing in it that could be said without breaking in the middle. The letter was still in his truck's glove box. He drove with it there the way people keep things they're not ready to put down. Rook had come into his life 5 months ago through the same veteran support program that had placed Atlas. He was also a black Malinois. Caleb had not wanted another black Malinois and had said so to the program coordinator, who had said she understood, and had then sent him a photograph of Rook that Caleb had looked at for 30 seconds before calling back and saying fine. The thing about Rook was that he did not try to be Atlas. He was quieter. He watched more and moved less. He would go for an entire morning without requesting anything: food, attention, a walk, and simply be present in whatever room Caleb was in. Like a colleague who understood that not everything needed to be said, they had not yet found their full footing with each other. Caleb knew it. He suspected Rook knew it too. Some bonds needed time and the right moment to click into place. They were still waiting on both. He hit the brakes carefully on the ice and pulled to the shoulder. Rook was already at the window. Caleb got out and walked to the fence line, and what he saw in the sleek gray dark was a German shepherd, female. That weighed maybe 50 pounds less than she should have, chained to a post with a heavy logging chain, the kind used to secure equipment, not dogs. She was sitting upright in the frozen field, not lying down, which told him she had enough left in her not to give up, though not much more than that. Her coat was soaked through. She did not bark at him. She watched him come through the fence with the still careful attention of an animal that had stopped expecting anything to arrive, and had not yet decided what to make of the fact that something had. He looked back at Rook. Rook had come through the fence without being told, and was standing 6 feet to Caleb's left, watching the same dog, not approaching, giving her space. Caleb squatted down. He stayed there. The shepherd looked at him for a long moment, and then carefully leaned forward and put her nose against his hand. The chain around her neck had been there long enough that the skin beneath the collar had grown around the edges of it, in the way skin does when something has pressed against it for months. Not days. Months. There was a house at the end of the drive with one light on. Caleb walked to it with Rook at his side and the shepherd following them, trailing her chain through the dead grass, and knocked on the door. The man who opened it was 79 years old and looked like he had been waiting for something to go wrong for so long that the arrival of a stranger in the dark barely registered as unusual. His name was Earl Poston. He was 6 feet tall and had been bigger once. The clothes he wore had been bought for a wider man, and his eyes, behind thick-framed glasses, were the pale gray blue of a winter sky before it decides what it's going to do. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Rook. He looked down at the shepherd who had come to stand at Caleb's heel, and something moved across his face that he put away quickly. "She's mine," he said. It was not a defensive statement. It was the statement of a man explaining something he was ashamed of. Caleb said he knew. He said he'd come to ask if he could bring her inside out of the ice. Earl looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. The inside of the house told a story that the outside had been keeping. It was neat in the way that men who have lived alone for years keep things neat, out of habit and a kind of respect for the woman who had taught them the habit. A photograph on the mantel. A wedding anniversary cross-stitch in a frame above the kitchen door. On the kitchen table, a Bible with a red ribbon bookmark and a coffee cup with the handle broken off and replaced with a strip of electrical tape. Because Earl Poston was not a man who threw away something that still worked. But the kitchen tap, when Caleb reached past Earl to turn it on, produced nothing. Not a low-pressure trickle. Nothing. He asked about the water. Earl said the county had shut it off. A complaint had been filed, he said. A plumbing code violation. He said he'd called the county office 3 times and been told it was under review. Caleb asked how long. 11 days, Earl said. He'd been buying gallon jugs at the feed store in town. He ran out 2 days ago. He'd been melting snow off the porch in a stock pot on the wood stove. Rook walked to the far end of the kitchen without being told. He stopped in front of the door to a small utility room and stood there, still and quiet. Caleb opened the door. Inside, a dog crate with no bedding, a single metal bowl on the floor, empty and bone dry, and on the shelf above the crate, a second bowl, ceramic with the word Bella painted on the side in blue letters, turned upside down. He came back to the kitchen. He asked Earl about the bowl on the shelf. Earl was quiet for a long time looking at his electrical taped coffee cup. Then he said, he took her water dish too. He sat across the table from Earl Poston and listened, because that was what this moment needed, and because he had learned, in 11 years of situations where listening was the only correct action, that the fastest way to understand something was to be still and let it come. Earl talked for nearly an hour. He had lived on this property for 31 years, 2 miles south of where Highway 89 bends toward the Gallatin Canyon. He had retired from the Burlington Northern Railroad in 2014. 40 years of service, the last 12 of them as a senior engineer on the Havre subdivision running coal out of the Powder River Basin. His wife Donna had died in 2019, a Tuesday in June, while he was working in the garden and she was reading on the porch, and he had looked up and she had simply been gone. The way people sometimes go when their bodies have held on just long enough for them to be somewhere they loved. He had kept the property. He had the pension. He had Bella, who was a German shepherd he'd raised from 8 weeks old, and who slept at the foot of his bed and knew the way dogs know things. When he was having a bad night, and would come up and put her head on his chest until it passed. 8 months ago, a man named Deputy Sheriff Wade Cutler had knocked on his door. Cutler's property adjoined Earl's on the east side, 40 acres of dry Montana rangeland that a development company out of Billings had been trying to acquire for 2 years as part of a larger parcel. Earl's 12 acres sat between Cutler's property and a county road access point that the development needed for a planned subdivision. Without Earl's land, or at minimum an easement across it, the project couldn't proceed. Earl had been approached twice by the development company's representative, a man named Garrett Lyle, and had said no both times. Not rudely, not with any drama, simply no. This is where I live. I'm not interested. After the second refusal, Wade Cutler had come to his door. Cutler was a Gallatin County Sheriff's deputy with 15 years on the job and a reputation in the county for getting things done. He had told Earl, that first evening, that Earl seemed like a reasonable man and that reasonable men usually found a way to work things out. Earl had said he was happy to be reasonable about things that weren't his home. Cutler had looked at him for a moment and then said he'd been by recently and noticed some code issues Earl might want to know about. Earl had asked what kind of code issues. Cutler had said all kinds. The campaign had started with a noise complaint. A neighbor 3 properties over had reported that Earl's generator ran past 10 p.m. It ran past 10 p.m. once during a power outage for 4 hours. Earl had received a formal warning, then a property maintenance violation for an outbuilding with a corrugated roof panel that had lifted in a November windstorm, then a complaint about the fence line along the highway, which Earl had checked and found entirely within code. Then, 2 months ago, a plumbing inspection that identified a failed pressure valve on the water main, an inspection that Earl had not requested and that had been filed, as Caleb would later discover, under Cutler's own badge number as the reporting officer. The water had been shut off 11 days ago, pending a repair compliance review. Bella had been chained outside 6 days ago after Cutler filed an animal control complaint stating that the dog had charged and bitten him near the property line. Earl said Bella had not left the yard. Earl said he had no doubt in his mind about what had happened and who had made it happen. He said this quietly, without heat, in the voice of a man who has understood the geometry of his situation, completely and simply cannot find an exit from it. On the kitchen table, half under the Bible, was a piece of paper. Caleb picked it up. It was a county court notice, a nuisance abatement order citing 6 code violations filed over 8 months, requiring the property owner to vacate the premises pending remediation review. It had been served yesterday. The compliance deadline was Friday. It was Wednesday evening. Caleb set the paper down. He looked at Rook, who had come back to stand near Earl's chair in the soulful, unhurried way he had, and was watching Caleb with the dark, steady attention that Caleb was still getting used to. He asked Earl if he'd had any legal representation. Earl said he'd talked to a lawyer in Bozeman who had told him the process would cost more than the property was worth. He asked if Earl had any family nearby. Earl said his son Marcus had passed 2 years ago overseas. He said it the way people say the things they've learned to carry, not without weight, just without performance. Are you in a position right now where you've seen enough to know what's happening to Earl and you're wondering if you'd stop or keep driving? Type yes or no in the comments. Be honest with yourself. I read every single one. Caleb made 3 calls that night from Earl's kitchen table, while Earl fed Bella a bowl of warm broth from a stock pot on the wood stove, and Rook sat against Earl's leg without being asked. The first call was to a woman named Captain Dana Frick, who ran the veteran legal clinic at the Montana Legal Services office in Bozeman, and who owed Caleb a favor from the year before when he'd spent a Saturday helping her brother-in-law move furniture in a February. Ice storm not unlike this one. She answered on the second ring. He told her what he had. She asked 3 questions and then said she'd have someone at the Gallatin County Courthouse when it opened at 8. The second call was to a man named Sergeant First Class, retired Dennis Hobart, who now ran a property rights advocacy organization out of Billings and who, when Caleb described the pattern of code complaints filed under a single badge number, said the phrase abusive process twice before Caleb finished the sentence. The third call was the one he hadn't planned to make. He had found, while looking through the papers on Earl's table for anything else relevant to the case, a sealed envelope tucked inside the Bible's back cover. It was addressed to Earl in handwriting that was clearly military, tight, functional, vertical, and a return address in the upper left corner was a forward operating base in Kandahar province. The name above the address was Petty Officer Second Class Marcus A. Poston, USN. It had never been opened. Caleb turned it over in his hands. He asked Earl about it. Gently, Earl said the Red Cross had sent it after Marcus was killed. He said he hadn't been able to open it. He said it had been sitting in that Bible for 22 months. Caleb looked at the postmark date. His hands went still. Marcus Poston had been in the same forward element as Danny Reyes. Danny Reyes had been Caleb's closest teammate for 7 years, the man who had survived 4 deployments with him and died in the training accident in Coast Province 6 weeks before Caleb came home. Caleb had not known that Danny had a connection to Bozeman. He had not known that the quiet man from Montana that Danny used to mention, always shared his food, never complained, best situational awareness in the element, was Earl Poston's son. He hadn't known any of it until he sat at a kitchen table in a Montana ice storm because a dog lifted its head on the highway and stood up. The next morning, Dana Frick's associate filed an emergency stay of the vacate order with the Gallatin County District Court, citing procedural irregularities in 6 of the 8 code complaints and the documented pattern of filings under Deputy Cutler's badge number. By 10 o'clock, the stay had been granted pending a full evidentiary review. At 11:15, Wade Cutler's cruiser turned down Earl's gravel drive. He came through the front door without knocking, which told Caleb everything he needed to know about how Wade Cutler had been operating on this property for 8 months. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, in his mid-40s, wearing his county uniform with the easy authority of someone who had been the largest presence in any room he'd entered for a long time. He looked at Earl, he looked at Caleb, he looked at Rook, and then he looked away from Rook, because Rook was the one thing in the room he couldn't place and couldn't control. Rook had stopped the moment Cutler stepped through the door. The sound that came from him was not a bark. It was low and continuous and deliberate, the sound of a decision already made and waiting on a reason to act. He had moved without any command from Caleb to a position between Earl's chair and the center of the room, and his eyes had not left Wade Cutler since the door opened. His body was still, not the stillness of a dog waiting to be told what to do, the stillness of a dog that has already decided. Cutler said he'd heard there was some kind of legal filing. He said he wanted Earl to understand that a filing didn't change the underlying violations. He said this in the measured voice of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow to understand it, and he took one step toward Earl's chair. Rook took one step forward. The growl dropped half a register. Cutler stopped from the kitchen table. He didn't raise his voice. When you have spent 11 years in rooms where the difference between a conversation and a casualty was how controlled you kept yourself, you learn that quiet authority carries farther than volume. He said that the stay had been granted at 10 a.m. that morning. He said he had Dana Frick on the phone and Dennis Hobart on record, and that the pattern of code violations filed under Cutler's badge number over 8 months had been formally submitted to the county sheriff's office as evidence of abusive process. He said a second complaint had been filed with the Montana Law Enforcement Academy Standards Board that morning, citing the animal control report on Bella, which 3 neighbors had already provided written statements contradicting. He said all this quietly, looking at Cutler, not at the floor, and not at the ceiling, and not anywhere else. Then Earl Poston spoke. He said it the way he had said everything since Caleb arrived, not performing it, not asking for pity, just stating the plain, true thing that had been sitting in him looking for a place to land. He took her water dish, too. The room was still. Cutler looked at Earl. He looked at Rook, who had not moved, whose eyes had not moved, whose growl had not stopped. He left. Rook watched the door for 30 seconds after it closed. Then, and not before, he walked to Earl's chair and lay down across the old man's feet. The legal process that followed took 11 weeks. The abusive process complaint resulted in an internal affairs investigation that found 5 of the 6 code violation filings procedurally unsupported. Deputy Sheriff Wade Cutler received a formal reprimand, was removed from field enforcement pending review, and was required to recuse himself from any matter involving properties adjacent to his own. The animal control order against Bella was vacated. The water service to Earl's property was restored 9 days after the stay was granted. After a county inspector reviewed the original plumbing complaint and found that the pressure valve cited in the report had in fact been replaced 12 years prior and was fully compliant, the development company withdrew its acquisition inquiry for Earl's parcel in March. Garrett Lyle, the company's representative, told a colleague that the property had become more trouble than it was worth. On the Sunday after the stay was granted, the Baptist congregation that Donna Poston had attended for 22 years, and that Earl had been attending with less regularity since she died, showed up at his property in 4 trucks. They brought a water heater, a cord of firewood, 3 casseroles, and a new collar for Bella, red, with a brass nameplate, her name stamped in clean capital letters. They also brought a man named Gerald Foss, who was a licensed plumber and a deacon, and who spent the afternoon installing the water heater while everyone else ate the casseroles, and Bella moved between people's knees, accepting attention with the dignity of a dog that had been through something, and come out the other side of it. Caleb was there. He sat on Earl's porch in the cold February sun and watched it happen. Rook leaned against his leg and felt something loosen in him that had been wound tight for 14 months. That evening, after everyone had gone, Earl brought out the sealed envelope. He held it for a moment, then he looked at Caleb and said, "Will you stay while I read it?" Caleb said yes. The letter was 4 pages in Marcus's tight military handwriting. In the 3rd page, Marcus had written about a man named Danny Reyes from San Antonio, Texas, who was the best person he had ever served beside, and who had a way of making the hardest days feel manageable, and who Marcus wanted his father to know about if things ever went the wrong way. He said Danny was the kind of man you met once if you were lucky, and spent the rest of your life trying to be a little more like. Earl read it twice. Then he folded it along its original creases and put it back in the envelope, and he set it on the table where he could see it, not inside the Bible. Outside, the last of the February light was going off the mountains to the west in that particular way it goes in Montana. Slowly, generously, like it has somewhere else to be but isn't in any hurry to get there. Rook was asleep on Earl's kitchen floor with his head on Earl's boot. Bella was asleep beside him, the 2 dogs breathing in the same slow rhythm, a red collar bright against her fur. There are moments that feel less like accident and more like something being set right. Caleb didn't have a word for what had led him down that gravel drive in a Montana ice storm. He believed in paying attention. He believed that a dog knows before we do, and that the correct response to that knowledge is to follow. He believed his teammate Danny Reyes had been trying, in whatever way the dead try things, to make sure that Marcus Poston's father was not alone in that house with the water shut off and the chain in the frozen field. He simply hadn't driven past. This story is for every person living quietly through something no one has asked about yet, and for every dog that has ever sat in a cold field and waited because there was nowhere else to go. Have you ever known someone like Earl? A neighbor, a parent, someone who kept going long after anyone would have blamed them for stopping? Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one. This section deserves their names. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe, so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you longest? I'll see you in the comments.